Hello, and welcome to the Geek Pantheon, your place for all geeky goodness, nerdy narcissisms, and favorite fandoms. I think I did that in the wrong order, but I'm not Eric, so here we are. Anyway, this episode is an unusual one, and it is sponsored by the Geek Lyceum, a fan-created book club that started on our Patreon Discord. And the idea for this video came from them, really, and particularly from our patron and super fan Laura, who made a deal with me that results in this video regarding her reading some books and my doing this video in exchange. So here we are. As always, this video is brought to you by our extremely generous patrons. Unlike Eric, I don't have an entire list of them, so I cannot read all of your names, though you very much deserve it, and we greatly appreciate your patronage as it allows us to do all sorts of ridiculous, nerdy things like this. So this video is the first in a couple of lore videos about Middle-earth. This video is going to serve as an introduction for any and all Middle-earth lore videos that I make on this channel. And is going to introduce J.R.R. Tolkien, his books, and the world of Middle-earth with some essentially what you need to know about Tolkien and his work and his world in order to really dig into it on a more academic and analytical level as opposed to just enjoying it, which, by the way, I assure you Tolkien firmly intended that you simply enjoy it. So if you're not at all interested in the deeper lore of Middle-earth, that's fine. Tolkien would take no insult. I certainly take no offense if you are bored by this very idea and stop watching now. But for those of you that have stuck with it, we're going to talk about Tolkien, his books, and the world that he created. So, for a start, some things you need to know about John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Tolkien was born to a well-off banker, his father Arthur, and Arthur worked for the Bank of Africa, which moved him and his family to South Africa, then a British colony, and that's where Tolkien spent his earliest childhood years, although he moved back to England fairly young, so didn't remember a lot of his life in Africa. However, while he and his mother and siblings were on a visit to England, Tolkien's father, Arthur, came down with rheumatic fever and died while his mother was actually on the boat back to South Africa. So when she arrived in South Africa, having missed his funeral, which is a ridiculous thing for us to imagine today, but life at the turn of the 20th century, very different. So Tolkien and his family returned to England, and he moved in initially with his mother's parents, but then they moved to a little home in the country in Warwickshire, and Tolkien always loved this rural part of the country, and it had a lot of influence on what would later in his works become the Shire. Tolkien's mother handled his education, except little odd note, except in the area of geometry, which was handled by his Aunt Jane. His Aunt Jane is notable in that she lived in a house at the end of a lane, but she did not like French words, and so she refused to call her lane a cul-de-sac. So instead, she simply translated that from French straight into English, making her the lane on which her home was called Bag End. Tolkien was an early lover of language. His cousins had invented a language called Animalic, and Tolkien got really interested in that while he was still learning Latin and German from his mother. But very quickly, he started inventing more complicated constructed languages, and did that all throughout his youth. Another thing about Tolkien that you need to understand is that he was, from a young age, an artist. He grew up drawing and sketching, and in fact, if you have the means to visit the Tolkien Maker of Middle-earth exhibit going on in England, and I think coming to New York sometime this year, I would encourage you to do so because you can see just a vast display of Tolkien's artistic work, his drawings and sketches and paintings. Tolkien designed the dust jackets for most of his books initially. He drew the initial map of Middle-earth. So Tolkien was an artist of no small skill as well. But the first and foremost thing that Tolkien would have said he was, and that you need to understand about him if you want to appreciate his books on a deeper level, is that Tolkien was a philologist. He was a linguist. He studied the way that language developed and the way that language was used in literature. And this is, of course, why Tolkien so loved to make up languages. But one of the things that this causes to be true about Tolkien's world is that names matter a lot. It's almost always worth looking up translations of the names of places and people in Tolkien. And you discover odd things. For example, if you translate any of the names of the kings of Rohan from the appendices in the book, all of them end up just meaning something to the effect of king, except for the first one, Eorl, which just means warrior, because he wasn't yet a king. And this may seem really weird. Why would Tolkien do that? Because, of course, those can't possibly be the names of all these people, because they didn't know. In many cases, they were younger sons or people who didn't expect to become king. This is partly because Tolkien presents this idea that he's not the author, but the translator of this work. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But Tolkien is a philologist. He loved language, and his work on Middle-earth was largely to provide a history that justified the languages that he was inventing. So that matters a great deal, and Tolkien worked very hard throughout his life to try and de-Frenchify as much English as he could, not appreciating the French effects on English, because when Tolkien believed he was an Englishman, and this is another important thing, Tolkien thought of himself as an Englishman, but what he meant by that was Old England, like the Anglo-Saxons. Tolkien would have described himself as living in Mercia, which was one of the old petty kingdoms of pre-unification England, before the Norman conquest, before even the Saxons had conquered all of England and unified it. So Old England, this is what Tolkien loved. He loved the geography, and in fact the geography of Warwickshire, where he spent his childhood, and Oxfordshire, where he spent his adulthood, both play a huge role in Tolkien's world. For example, Oxfordshire would have been in the Old Kingdom of Mercia, but Mercia is a French word for the place, and its closest thing would be the West Saxon word Mearc. And Tolkien said that what a Mercian would have called his homeland, he said he would have been from the Mark, which in Middle-earth we of course know is the name that the people who live there give to the country of Rohan. And then as to Warwickshire, as I said, a lot of the geography of that came to the Shire in its settled and well-kept farmland. And what Tolkien was trying to accomplish in writing was he wanted there to be a true mythology for England. He felt that a lot of England's original mythology had been lost. We had little snippets of it in things like Beowulf, but most of it had either been co-opted by the Normans when they conquered and made French, or else had been destroyed as pagan when England had been Christianized. And so he wanted to know what was the old pre-Christian mythology of England, and he felt that had been lost somehow. So that was what Tolkien was really trying to accomplish when he wrote Lord of the Rings, and to a lesser extent The Hobbit, and definitely the Silmarillion. Were all intended to become a mythology for England. We'll talk about that idea of mythology here in a minute more. The next thing you know about Tolkien is Tolkien was the world's biggest romantic. Tolkien loved romance in the sense of adventure stories. That was instilled in him from a young age by his mother, who read him Norse mythology and old stories and Arthurian romance, and he loved all of that. But he is also romantic in the sense that we traditionally use this. Tolkien's romance with his wife, Edith, is a fantastic story in its own right. Edith and Tolkien met when he was 16, she was 19. And he was studying for university, but his guardian believed that Edith, who was a Protestant, was a bad influence on Tolkien, and he forbade him to pursue her, even though they had been spending time together and he had developed a very, very passionate love for her. And Tolkien was forced to choose between abandoning his guardian, who was his caretaker and really had become a father to him following the death of his mother, and losing Edith. And he chose to obey his guardian, and he and Edith didn't correspond for another 3 years until Tolkien turned 21 and was free of his guardian. On his 21st birthday, he writes to Edith proposing marriage. She abandons an engagement that she has. She's become engaged, and she abandons that and sends the ring back, and takes up Tolkien's offer, and the two become engaged. And they're engaged for several years while Tolkien is at university before they actually marry. The reason that they come to marry is that Tolkien, upon graduating, immediately enlisted in the army, and this is in 1916, so World War I is in the middle. We're in the middle of World War I, and Tolkien and Edith married only days before he would ship off to France. And this is one of the really important things you have to understand, is Tolkien is a combat veteran. He's part of that generation of authors who were traumatized by World War I and used, in a lot of ways, used their work as writers to process what had happened to them. Tolkien joined the war late. This was somewhat scandalous for a man of his class to wait, but he was allowed to because he was in the middle of his university studies, so he waited till graduation before he joined the war. He took part in the Battle of the Somme, which was one of the bloodiest, most terrible battles of the war, and in this process he lost most of his good friends. All but one or two of his close friends from university days were killed in the war. Tolkien himself was engaged heavily in combat and was eventually put on sick leave, having developed what was called trench fever, basically just some sort of infection from being wet and muddy and disgusting all the time, and was put on sick leave behind the lines, back from the lines in France. While on sick leave, this is when he actually begins writing the earliest stories of Middle-earth, particularly about the fall of Gondolin. But the experience on the Somme, the experience of combat, plays a big role throughout Tolkien's work. You can see it in the language that he talks about with combat in his books when he describes it. Even in The Hobbit early on, which only has the one big battle scene, but even in The Hobbit, the attack on Dale on Lake Town by the dragon, Smaug, is repelled by these archers led by Bard. And if you look at the language that Tolkien uses in describing Bard's defense, it's very, very modern language. It's all about holding your ground and fighting to the last arrow, and these terms that very much would be very would sound very correct on a firing line in a modern war, fighting to the last round, holding your position, that sort of thing. So Tolkien's experience of war affected the way he talked about war. His experience coming home from war and being haunted by it affects the way that we see Frodo come back from the quest in a lot of ways. And the no man's land, the space between the trenches, Tolkien himself said inspired the dead marshes, this vast muddy space with dead men lying just under the surface of the water. Was just a direct borrowing from Tolkien's actual experience at war. Another kind of happier thing about Tolkien's combat experience is that this is another place where he starts to develop fake languages. Tolkien created this is not exactly a language, but a code of dots that he included in the margins that looked like doodles, in the margins of all of his letters back to Edith. And these dots, Edith could decode and know where Tolkien was and what was going on, because this would prevent that information from being censored by the army censors who would black out the things that soldiers weren't supposed to tell their families. And so Tolkien found a way around that using his linguistic skills by creating this code of dots. When Tolkien returned from the war, he took up his life with Edith. He also got a job working initially for the Oxford English Dictionary, and helping there, and eventually teaching at Oxford as a professor of Anglo-Saxon. That's when Tolkien and his family, or Tolkien and Edith started their family. They had several children, and Tolkien was just the coolest dad in a lot of ways. Some of his works are directly come out of being stories he made up for his children. The Hobbit even begins that way. Everyone knows Tolkien fans know the story of the blank page while he's grading, where he writes down, "In a hole in the ground lived a hobbit." But he didn't actually start novelizing that except by telling it to his sons. He would tell it to his children, tell stories about this Bilbo Baggins, this hobbit. And apparently Christopher, his oldest son, kept noticing when he got things wrong. And so Tolkien was forced to start writing things down. He would change what color someone's cloak was, or what time they arrived, or things like that. And Christopher would catch these inconsistencies in the story. And so Tolkien started writing them down. And that's the beginning of the novelization aspect of this story that he was just making up for his children. Everyone, we all remember writing letters to Santa. Tolkien's children wrote letters to Father Christmas. But here's the thing. Father Christmas wrote back in the Tolkien household because Tolkien created letters from Father Christmas, made elaborate stamps that he put on the envelopes that made it look like they came from the North Pole. And in it, Father Christmas tells these exciting stories about battling trolls and his friend the polar bear and all of these exciting adventures that he has during the holiday season. And these are published as letters from Father Christmas. You can read them, but they're magnificent. They're hilarious. Tolkien writes them in this beautiful but kind of spidery handwriting that he explains as Father Christmas having arthritis, and so having a hard time keeping his pen still as he writes. And so Tolkien even created a penmanship for Father Christmas, which is fantastic. And then probably the best example of Tolkien using storytelling as a father is his son. Michael had a toy dog. I think it was Michael. Anyway, had a toy dog called Rover, and on vacation at the beach, the dog fell out of Michael's pocket and was lost. And Tolkien and the boys went up and down the beach, and they just couldn't find him. And Michael was heartbroken. This was his favorite toy. And so Tolkien told a story about how Rover wasn't really a toy. Rover was a real dog who had been enchanted by a wizard and turned into a toy, and then purchased by Edith and given to her son. But he'd now fallen back into the sand, and was now, with the help of a sand wizard, going to find his way back to becoming a real dog once again, and find his way home back to the boy. And this is the story Roverandom, which you can buy as a novella, which Tolkien published later on in life. But it's fantastic, it's entirely written to cheer up his son. Tolkien was also a beloved professor. His students loved him. One of his students said that Tolkien made his classroom a mead hall. Tolkien wanted his students to appreciate Anglo-Saxon literature and poetry and languages, and he was a beloved teacher by his students. He was also a bit of an eccentric. For example, there's this hilarious story of Tolkien and his good friend C.S. Lewis arriving at a fancy dress party, but dressed as polar bears. It's not a costume party. It's like everyone's dressed up, but not costumes. Everyone's in like tuxes and suits. But Tolkien and Lewis show up dressed as polar bears. Just because. Apparently he once chased a neighbor down the street wielding an axe and dressed as a Viking warrior, just as a prank. So he's a bit of an eccentric. He had a lot of unpopular academic opinions. He was not a huge fan of Shakespeare, which you can imagine is heresy at Oxford. He felt that Shakespeare missed a lot of opportunities in his work, and that things could have been done better. And in fact, he does try to better Shakespeare in a few places. For example, Tolkien really disliked the end of Macbeth. He disliked the solution to the riddle about Birnam Wood coming to Dunsinane. He didn't think it was funny. He didn't think it was interesting enough for it to be just men carrying sticks. That's the woods coming. And so, of course, in The Lord of the Rings, the woods really do move. And this is, in a lot of ways, perhaps inspired by Macbeth. And Tolkien improving on Macbeth. The other eccentric thing about Tolkien is his writing method, and this is going to be important in some of the videos we make that I'll be making about this. Tolkien just started writing. When Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, it was not set in Middle-earth. Middle-earth was a separate thing. It was about his elvish stories, his stories that would eventually become the Silmarillion. But The Hobbit had nothing to do with that. It was just a story. And as he started writing the sequel, initially it was also not in Middle-earth. And it only started to be in Middle-earth as he got going. Because the way that Tolkien wrote is he would start writing, and he would write up until it stopped making sense to him. And then he'd stop, and he'd go back and he'd rewrite it with the things that he liked kept in and explained. And so Tolkien would just insert things into his writing that he thought were interesting, but he had no idea why it actually fit. And then in a rewrite, he'd make it make sense. Tom Bombadil is a good example of that. Tom Bombadil is just something from Tolkien's other work of poems he wrote for children, and he liked him, and so he puts him in the story, but it doesn't really make sense in Middle-earth, and so Tolkien has to go back and sort of work a way in which Tom makes sense by adjusting both the other writings about Tom Bombadil and the old writings. And so what happens over the course of Lord of the Rings is all of these different writings, the Silmarillion, the Adventures of Tom Bombadil, a lot of Tolkien's previously published poetry, The Hobbit, and of course the Lord of the Rings, all of these are separate projects, but over the course of Lord of the Rings, they're all slowly pulled together as Tolkien grabs and pulls in names from the Silmarillion and pulls in poems that he'd published elsewhere and pulls in stories about Tom Bombadil and all these other things that slowly become a part of this. So you get this web that's gradually more and more connected. And by the end of it, we have what we call the Legendarium, which is all of Tolkien's work, which is, for the most part, with the exception of a handful of minor works, is all one big story set in Middle-earth. The last thing we need to know about Tolkien, well, not the last thing, but the last thing you really have to know about Tolkien to understand his works is that he's a devout Catholic. Tolkien claimed to a friend that Lord of the Rings was a fundamentally Catholic work. Now, by that he did not mean that it's like the Chronicles of Narnia, where it's an allegory. Tolkien did not write it as an allegory. But what Tolkien was trying to say is that if I had any other worldview, the book would have been entirely different. Tolkien's work reflects his Catholic worldview. It simply does. It's not done in an extremely overt way in the sense that Narnia is, written specifically for that purpose by Lewis, but it nonetheless, it would be an entirely different thing. You can't end up with that world from a position that doesn't assume a theistic worldview. And that's what Tolkien is trying to say when he says this is a fundamentally Catholic world. So that's important to understand about Tolkien as well, is his religion affects his work. Okay, so a thing to note about the books, about the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and the Silmarillion, they're mythology. Tolkien rejected the idea of them as allegory, especially an allegory for World War II, because of course he had started writing it well before World War II, and it doesn't actually match up to World War II very well. And when Tolkien says he rejects it as allegory, what he means is the books are not allegories, they're not fables or parables, the way perhaps The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is much more of an allegory, although not an exact one. Because in an allegory, this represents this. There's a one-to-one representation of things in the story to things in the real world. And that's not what we have in The Lord of the Rings. Instead, The Lord of the Rings is a myth. It is applicable in a lot of ways. It explains something fundamental about the world, and we're going to talk about what I think that is here in a minute, but you can't just say the ring is atomic weapons, or the ring is sin, or the ring is drugs, or any of these other things. You could apply the ring to all of those things, in that it's extremely powerful, it's addictive, it's all of this stuff, but it's not made to represent one of those things in the way that, say, Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia represents Jesus. He does. That's what Lewis intended. He is intended to be the Son of God. Tolkien didn't mean, there's no figure like that in Tolkien. There are lots of figures that you could apply that archetype of the sacrificial figure, but no one was intended to represent him. Gandalf comes back from the dead, but that's not something that only exists in Christian belief. Frodo sacrifices himself for everyone, but again, that's not a uniquely Christian thing. So when Tolkien calls it a myth, he's saying it can be applied to life, but it's not an allegory. It's not a one-to-one connection to something in the real world. Okay, so that's outside the world. Let's talk about inside the world. There are a few things you need to understand about Ea, that is, everything that is within Middle-earth. Ea is the universe in Tolkien's Legendarium. Okay? The first is when you talk about the nature of good and evil. Good is love. Evil is lust. And what I mean by that is this. Love, good, is nurturing. It's giving. It's selfless. Things that you do with good, with love, are things like creation. You use your creativity and do things in service to others or in service to ideas. And this is part of what Tolkien called sub-creation. Tolkien believed that as a believer in God, a way that he honored God was by being creative, just as he believed God was. And we see that happen in Tolkien's Legendarium in the story of the creation of the dwarves by the Valar. The Valar are like demigods, archangels. They're godlike creatures that govern Middle-earth for Ilúvatar, who is the Eru, the one god. The dwarves are created by a Vala called Aula, and Aula creates the dwarves without telling Eru and without getting permission from Eru. And when Eru catches him, because of course Eru knows everything, he says, "What have you done? Why have you done this? Do you desire puppets? That's all these can ever be to you, because you don't have the power to give them real life, only I do." And Aula says, "I didn't want that. I wanted them to be actual creatures that I could love and that could know who I am and know who you are. But I see now that I've done wrong." And so he's willing to destroy the dwarves, but instead Eru, because Aula did not do this out of mockery or out of a desire for power, but out of a desire to imitate Eru rather than to mock or usurp Eru's place, Eru honors that and gives the dwarves life. And so sub-creation, creating an imitation of the grand creator, in Tolkien's worldview, God, in Middle-earth, Eru, is an important aspect here, and the creation is a big deal. The Valar are these supernatural beings, these godlike beings who govern Arda, which is the created world. And they're present but not very visible in The Lord of the Rings. They're mentioned a couple of times. The elves frequently reference Elbereth, who's one of them. Faramir and his men stand and face west in honor of the Valar, because way out the west is where the Valar live, which is why west is a big deal. But they're not very present. The most present form in which they take is in the eagles. The eagles are the messengers of Manwë, who's like Zeus. He's the king of the Valar. And the eagles do his bidding, and there's messengers and go around watching things for him in Middle-earth. And so that's sort of the closest thing you have to the presence of the Valar, with the exception of the wizards. The wizards are also angelic beings. They're Maya spirits who have come as messengers from the Valar. And so Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, the other wizards are all present there. Sauron is also a Maya. He's a corrupted fallen Maya. Balrogs are also Maya spirits. But these are beings that the reason the Valar are in Arda is because when it was created, they loved it. They loved their participation in its creation with Eru, and they wanted to go into it and become a part of it. And that's why they're there in the first place, is out of that love for it. And then the other thing about love here is that love really does conquer all in Middle-earth. It really does. It sounds cheesy, but it's very true. You look at the story of Beren and Luthien. It's the story of these two star-crossed lovers going on this extremely dangerous quest so that they can be together, because that's the price of being able to marry, because Luthien is a princess and her father won't allow the marriage unless this is achieved. And through their love and through their power, through the power of that, they achieve this. And several times Luthien's love for Beren actually essentially pulls him back from the brink of death. So love has a power in here. We see that also with Frodo and Sam, and I don't mean this in a Frodo and Sam are a gay way. They're not. It's just not what Tolkien intended. What Tolkien is representing in Frodo and Sam is the love, the brotherhood that you can experience in going through horrible trauma with people. And for Tolkien, this would particularly reference the experience of brotherhood that develops on the battlefield. And this plays a central role in that story, is that Frodo and Sam's friendship and love for each other holds them both together. And so love is a huge overpowering ability, overpowering thing in Middle-earth. Evil, on the other hand, is lust. It is a selfish desire to dominate, to devour. But it's also self-destructive. We see this devouring idea in Ungoliant, who's this evil spider-like entity in the Silmarillion, who devours anything beautiful and just makes it not anymore. She devours it. She hates and desires all beauty and seeks to destroy it. And at the end of her tale is that supposedly she devoured even herself in her lust and hunger. Dragons, of course, are this wonderful example of greed and selfishness in that they hoard gold and lay on it. They never use it. They don't know what it's good for, but they hoard it. They keep it for themselves, and that curses it. And in fact, people are susceptible to dragon sickness. Thorin falls victim to dragon sickness at the end of The Hobbit. The master of Lake Town, we're told at the end of The Hobbit, falls victim to dragon sickness, steals a bunch of the gold, and runs off and dies in the wasteland. And then one of the most evocative images in Tolkien of this evil is the Wraith, the ring wraiths in particular, because the Wraith is a creature that, through its desire for power, has in fact become enslaved and has lost its selfhood. The ringwraiths once were these great kings and warriors and sorcerers, but through their desire for power, they become enslaved by Sauron and have lost who they are. They've lost their individuality. They've lost their self, so that they really are nothing. They're just empty. And they have to wear these big cloaks to give shape to their nothingness. And they're entirely subservient to Sauron's will, and their very existence on Middle-earth is even held by him. And the evil seeks dominance. Melkor, the initial evil being in the Silmarillion, was once a good Valar. He was an angel, an angelic being, a god. And during the creation of the world, which we'll talk about here in a second, he was not satisfied to join in the music, the theme of Eru and the other Valar and Maiar, and sought to create on his own, for his own glory, not out of love, not out of desire to better anything, but just for his own ennoblement and glorification. And in doing so, he mars the work. And that's all he seeks to go about doing from that point on, is just he messes up anything everyone else does. He tries to create, but he can't. The orcs aren't his. The orcs are created from twisting elves. Trolls are created in mockery of Ents. And all of these things, all these evil beings, have their will tied back to him. So though they act on their own, they're always going to be inclined to follow his desires ultimately, even long after he's gone from the world. And ultimately, evil is going to result in fear. Sauron, we're told, judges everyone by his own merit, and so he lives in fear of the ring, even though he loves it, even though he desires it. He fears it because it's lost. And he is expecting someone to come forward wielding the ring and overthrow him. And this fear drives him. That's how he's acting, is he's reacting in fear of this outcome. In the story of Numenor in the Silmarillion, in the portion of the Silmarillion called the Akalabeth, We see that the Númenórean kings, who were the humans that Aragorn is descended from, the Númenórean kings had this special thing. When they came time to die, they could choose to simply give up their lives and simply choose to die. And they often did this to leave their sons king while they were still in their prime. And they lived hundreds of years, so it's not like short lives or anything. But that as the Númenórean kings fell into evil, they began to fear death, rather than view it as the ability to finally be free of Arda and go beyond the spheres of the world and join Iluvatar, Eru, which is the gift that death is. They began to fear it and cling to life, and thus died in agony. And so that fear made their deaths more terrible. So evil ultimately results in fear and self-destruction. And then the last thing about evil in Middle-earth is that it is kind of infectious. It's a thing you do, but it's also often a thing that happens to you. We see this with the ring a lot, because on the one hand, we see that the ring seems to tempt people to do things. It tempts Boromir to take the ring. It tempts Frodo to put on the ring over and over again. It tempted Gollum when he first found it, or Smeagol as he was then. But sometimes it also seems to act on its own. Evil seems to have its own being. In the Prancing Pony, the ring slips onto Frodo's finger. He doesn't put it on, it slips onto him. And so evil is both a thing you can do, but it also can sort of happen to you. It's this sort of infectious thing. And that's another aspect of evil. So good and evil are very, very carefully defined through the demonstration of Middle-earth stories as we see them go by. The best example of that infection, other than the ring, would be the Oath of Feanor in the Silmarillion. Feanor creates these beautiful jewels, the Silmarils, and when they're stolen, he swears this terrible oath to get them back. And his sons join him in this oath, in which they call the Valar and Eru himself as witnesses and call the eternal darkness down on themselves if they fail. And they swear to get the Silmarils no matter what. And they're driven by this oath. Oaths have power in Middle-earth. They're driven by this oath to do terrible things ultimately. And so this, even though the oath itself is not intended to be evil, they're trying to get back something that rightfully belongs to them. But the way in which they go about it is infected and tainted by evil because of this oath. So that's evil. Okay, the next thing about the worldview of Middle-earth is that music is power. Tolkien writes dozens and dozens and dozens of songs and poems throughout the books, and all of them are important, but they have power. The reason for this in Middle-earth is that the world was created by music. At the beginning of the Silmarillion, we learned that in the beginning there was Eru, the One, and he was it. And then he took thought and he created the Ainur, who would be the Valar and the Maiar, the angelic beings, the supernatural beings. And then, gathering them together, he began to propound themes of music to them, and they joined him in this music. And the music goes out into the void, and it is no longer void. The music goes out into the void, and through the music, everything is created. The world that is, Eru gives life to the music, and it becomes the world. So we see over and over again, music has immense power. Throughout the Silmarillion, we see there's literally this scene where a powerful elf, Finrod Felagund, has a singing contest with Sauron to try and overpower one another. Finrod trying to hide himself and weave an illusion with his song to hide himself from Sauron, and Sauron trying to find him. And it's presented as this contest of singing that has power. Luthien's song, we're told at one point, unleashes the spring. And so the singing is extremely powerful. We see it in the Lord of the Rings with the Black Riders fleeing the elves as they approach with their song. We see Tom Bombadil going around singing things into submission. Music is powerful in Middle-earth, and this is part of Tolkien's appreciation for music that he puts this in. The next thing is you have to understand the importance of nature. So Tolkien lived through a period in which England was increasingly industrializing, and he could literally watch the trees sort of receding up the hills from his office. And this really saddened him, and this theme of the loss of nature appears throughout Middle-earth. We have one of the Valar who is particularly associated with nature, Yavanna, and she's worried by the creation of the dwarves, and goes to her husband, Aula, who has created them, and she's worried because the dwarves they'll chop down trees to feed their forges so they can make. And so she goes to Manwë and asks, can't there be something to speak for the trees, Lorax-like? And Manwë consults with Eru, and it's revealed to us that Eru has already taken thought for this, and that the shepherds of the trees, the Ents, come into play here. And we have over and over again this representation of good is about living with nature. Tolkien's not exactly a hippie, but living, but not overusing, not ignoring or exploiting nature. Using it, yes. I mean, Tolkien didn't object to people cutting down trees to build houses and that sort of thing. But cutting down trees too much in one place and destroying a forest, Tolkien hated. Or the building of stupid-looking, ugly buildings when you could have built something nice that didn't block the view of the nice stream. He likes that. That bothers him. And Mordor is the opposite of this. Mordor is the example of land tortured. Mordor is created. You notice, if you look at a map, you may notice that Mordor doesn't really look natural. It's this weird three sets of mountains all side by side. You can kind of see it on my map right here behind me. It doesn't look like a natural formation, and it's not. Sauron made it. He made the mountains, and so they don't look natural. They look odd. And inside is this vast wasteland, because Sauron is just looking for utility. He doesn't care about the beauty. He wants utility. So he's strip-mined it, and he's got industrial farming going on around this weird inland sea way back in the south and east of Mordor. And the waste of nature, the exploitation and torture and destruction of it, Tolkien really loathed. And so that's a good a representation of evil in his stories, is the cutting down of trees you shouldn't, the reckless destruction. Sauron's orcs initially go and cut down trees in Fangorn because they need to feed the furnaces of Isengard, but eventually they start cutting them down just for fun, and that's where it's very much gone too far. And that's really ultimately what ticks off the Ents enough to go and try and smash Saruman in his house. Another important thing in Middle-earth is the idea of hope versus despair. And this is kind of what I want to wrap up on. The idea of hope is really important, but it's not entirely clear what people hope in. Tolkien is a Catholic, and so his hope is religious in nature, but there's very little talk of religion in Middle-earth. There's a little bit in the Silmarillion, and we hear about people worshiping Sauron, but we don't really see any religion among the good guys in Middle-earth. And so it isn't entirely clear what this hope is, but we're told that it's there, and that hope matters even when you really don't expect to survive or win. This idea of the long defeat that the elves have been fighting for so long, or the way that Frodo and Sam, going into Mordor, Gandalf describes this as a fool's hope. And the end of Return of the King, when Aragorn leads the armies of the Free People out to the Black Gates and fights this battle, just kind of vaguely hoping to draw the eye as long as possible, but really having no reason to believe that they'll be there, that the timing will line up right. I mean, why would they have any expectation that it does? And of course it does, which Tolkien called a eucatastrophe, this good sudden turn of fate. So there's hope, but hope doesn't seem to require expectation of good. Sam, when he's with Frodo in Mordor, he's thinking to himself, looking at Frodo and how sickly Frodo has become, and he starts to do the math of the food, whether they can get to Mount Doom, and then he starts to think, well, how are we going to get back? And then it clicks to him, oh, we're not going to get back. And it says that, Sam had been okay with that. He'd gone without hope for a long time, as long as despair could be put off, but now he's forced to really face the idea that this is a one-way trip. But even though he no longer has any hope to survive, he's able to keep going by simply sticking to his master. He still refuses despair. And that's important in Tolkien's worldview, and in the worldview of Middle-earth, is that hope, even in the face of utter destruction, hope even in the face of doom, hope even in the face of the unknown, is vital, and it's the thing that sets the good guys apart, or the wise apart, not necessarily the good guys. We see many good guys lose hope. But the thing that sets the wise apart is that they continue to try even when they don't have any expectation of victory or survival. And this is a very, very northern notion. Tolkien loved northern mythologies, and he loved the mythology of the Norse and Scandinavia, and that of course includes the story of Ragnarok, where the gods are going to die one day. So if that's true, why would anyone worship them? Why would anyone follow them? Why be a warrior and go off and die and go to Valhalla, which is just a waiting room for your ultimate defeat by the fire giants? And the fact that they did anyway, that there was something worthy in doing good deeds for their own ends, regardless of your expectation of what would come of it, that seems to resonate in Tolkien's work. When we see the idea of there being some kind of hope beyond death, but Tolkien is very unclear as to what it is. And this, of course, for Christians who share Tolkien's faith, resonates with the idea of heaven, but Tolkien's never really specifies heaven, especially not for men. The elves go to this place called the Halls of Mandos, which is really kind of limbo. It's not paradise. And the elves can, because they're immortal, flee back to the Undying Lands and live there, which is much more like paradise, live out the rest of their days there. But men and hobbits and other mortals die, and they go beyond the world. They leave the spheres of Ea and go out beyond it. But no one knows what that means. Because, of course, Tolkien is writing his mythology as if it were a pre-Christian mythology. And that's very interesting. It's a very strange contradiction in Tolkien, in that there's all this talk of hope, but not of what that hope is in exactly, other than the hope to simply continue to go. And the most enduring symbol in Tolkien of this hope is that of stars. So stars are very important in Tolkien. If you look at the deep history, if you go into the Silmarillion and look at the deep history, the stars have always been there. The stars existed when the elves woke for the first time. They exist before the sun and the moon. And so the stars are enduring. They're there even when the two trees that initially give light to the world are destroyed, and when the lamps before them had been destroyed by Melkor, and before the sun and the moon bring light, the stars are there. Stars are also a good thing in that Tolkien, being a boy from the country, would know that you see stars much better when it's darker. And there's this wonderful, poignant moment in Return of the King. Frodo is asleep in some crevasse. Sam is getting water, and he sits there and he's looking up into the murk that covers Mordor. This constant cloud of not exactly cloud, like smoke and vapor and pollution, essentially, that covers Mordor. And for just a moment, there's this gap, and through it, Sam sees a star. And he's pierced, it says, he's pierced by its beauty, and realizes for just this moment that there is beauty and goodness and greatness that is beyond everything happening here in the world. That the shadow ultimately is a small and passing thing, and that beauty that exists, the stars, the things beyond Earth, are going to endure even if Sauron wins. And that seems to be the symbol of hope, is that there is something that ideas, beauty, goodness, courage, these things have value that is entirely separate from their result. And that's ultimately what drives the heroes, is not an expectation of victory, not an expectation of survival, because most of our heroes start really at their key moments. They have no expectation. You know, Bilbo walks down into Smaug's lair really with no idea of what's going to happen. Frodo and Sam go into Mordor, Frodo fully expecting to die, Sam sticking along with his British stiff upper lip. None of the great heroes of Tolkien's stories expect victory, expect life exactly. They just go on. They find that will to go on. That is the image of courage in Tolkien's world. So that's kind of my introduction to Tolkien and his world. If you have questions, feel free to comment them, I guess. Or if you'd like to join a conversation about this, feel free to find us at our Facebook page at thegeekpantheon.com, at The Geek Pantheon on Facebook. You can email us at thegeekpantheon@gmail.com. Find us on all social media at The Geek Pantheon. And if you really like what we do and would like to see it done more or better, then you can join our Patreon community at The Geek Pantheon, where you will find many tiers that you can use to support us, and our patrons get access to our Discord, and there's just a fun community over there as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and if you can think of things you'd like discussed regarding Middle-earth, because that's kind of my area of expertise, let me know in the comments. If you'd like to see other things, other fandoms discussed more, let us know there, and we'll try to get someone who knows more about them to do that. But in the meantime, I'm Philip, and this has been The Geek Pantheon. Thanks for watching. Bye.